folks. I'm going to turn on the light. I love these orange pants. You folks here, look at my orange pants. Yeah, love my orange pants. They're linen. Yes, yeah, light and airy and bright. Yeah, they make me very happy. All right, this is the third of the St. John's Wort classes. So we looked at the first week, we looked just at an overview of St. John's Wort, its actions, its chemistry, all of that. Last week, we did the oils, topical oils, use of St. John's Wort infused into oil and then used externally. And so today we're going to look at it for internal usage. And for that, I did want to talk about the use of tea. So the primary ways that you're likely to find St. John's Wort for internal use, three primary ways. We're likely to find it available as a supplement, as a capsule or a tablet, as what we talked about earlier in the first class, as a standardized extract, right? A standardized extract has a guaranteed level of activity. In this case, it is for the hyperforin and hypericin content. It's standardized so that every single capsule has a guaranteed level of activity in the identified compounds. Now, the problem with that is when we're looking at single identified compounds as the primary constituents of interest, we're ignoring all of the other complex chemistry around the plant. And so this we've referred to a couple of times, generally is what's associated with a lot of the side effects and problems associated with the use of St. John's Wort in the standardized, highly concentrated sources. When we have a whole plant extract as a tincture, this is another way that you're likely to see it. Now we have a concentrated extract, because a tincture is a concentrated extract. We've used a solvent that the constituents of interest, the dianthrone compounds, they like alcohol. We oftentimes, generally, in a St. John's Wort tincture, we make it using fresh plants. And the reason for the fresh plants is because those dianthrones, those compounds of interest, are a deep red color. And so if we extract it properly at the right time, we're going to show evidence of those dianthrones in the presence of the tincture. We're going to see that we have a high concentration of that hyperforin and hypericin. But we've already discussed the limited mindset that says that hypericin and hyperforin are the only constituents of interest, right? So yes, we can concentrate and we can do a sort of standardization with a tincture, and we know that this is really good medicine. It's probably the best medicine that is able to be made at home with St. John's Wort, and this is going to be made primarily with fresh plant. But the reality is that St. John's Wort just blooms for one time out of the year. And if you miss that window of making St. John's Wort medicine, you have the rest of, or if you didn't make enough, or there wasn't enough St. John's Wort growing at that moment, whatever, you've got the rest of the year that St. John's Wort is not in bloom, but it's always been traditionally used as a medicine, and it's been used as dried plant. So we do have St. John's Wort as a tea. Many times people will kind of roll their eyes and they'll scoff at the use of St. John's Wort as a tea because, oh, well, when we've dried it, right, when we've dried the plant material then those dianthrones that we were so careful in making the fresh plant extraction, we specifically extracted them in fresh plants to preserve those dianthrones, and they're not there because we're using dried plant. If we subscribe to that limited mindset of what the chemistry of St. John's Wort is all about, then we're going to say, yeah, dried St. John's Wort is worthless. But there's such a rich history of usage there, and we acknowledge the complex chemistry of St. John's wort. So I don't mind using St. John's wort as a tea form, as a backup for use of things like the tincture. I think the tincture is the most effective form. Hi, Danielle, good morning. The capsules are acceptable, but the tea is just fine. So I think that in so many ways, this is once again one of those issues that purists who are insistent that the tincture is the very best form of the plant are also saying that the tea is a worthless part of the plant, create limitations in people's access to that plant. So we can acknowledge that it is best to use the tincture form, and also say, and also the tea is very, very good and very effective. All right. So I do want to talk about one of the primary reasons we take St. John's wort is because of its use as, people refer to it as nature's Prozac, right? As a mood elevator, as an antidepressant is the category that people put it into. Larger category, nervine, but nervines just are things that affect the nervous system. So we do like to be kind of more specific in how it affects us. The thing is, we're not really sure how St. John's wort works. We do know that there is some interaction with serotonin, so I want to discuss that today because that is going to be one of the primary concerns after the concerns with the liver interactions, which we've already discussed. We discussed the liver interactions in the first class in the overview. So I'm not going to go over that again, but I do want to focus on its effects on the nervous system, on our understandings of antidepressant medications and where they are right now, the potential interactions of St. John's wort with those. So when we're taking antidepressant medications, there's three primary categories of antidepressants. So the oldest ones MAOI stands for monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So monoamine oxidase, the suffix right here, ASE, indicates that it's an enzyme, and enzymes break things down, right? What this breaks down is the monoamines, right? The monoamines are the neurotransmitters, kind of a large category of neurotransmitters. And this includes serotonin, but it also includes norepinephrine, an adrenal hormone, and it includes dopamine, right? And a couple of other things, but those are kind of the larger monoamine oxidase. So this is the oldest class of antidepressant medications. Many of them are still in usage to this day, but because it's a broad category of inhibition, it has the widest range of effects on a wide range of those neurotransmitters. So monoamine oxidase, when the body is producing, we have a synapse right here, right? So we have, this is the axon of one nerve body, and this is the dendrite of another nerve body. And right here we have a synapse, the jump between one nerve body and another. And it is in jumping this synapse, this is why the body makes neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that jump along these synapses, these junctures, to send information along these neurological pathways, right? So when we are using serotonin, when serotonin is an important neurotransmitter for the processes that we're dealing with right now, that serotonin is going to go smoothly down this pathway. There are some bodies, some nervous systems. So the way that works is that the neurotransmitter is produced by the axon. It goes along here. It's produced and it jumps this synapse to this dendrite, and then the body produces a compound called monoamine oxidase. And monoamine oxidase, being an enzyme, stops this because you don't want a constant trigger of a pathway, right? You want to trigger and then release, trigger and release. So the body triggers that and releases. But there are some bodies that produce a really high amount of this enzyme. And so they're trying to produce these neurotransmitters, but this enzyme is really, really aggressive, and it's always breaking them down before they're even able to cross that synapse. Right? And so MAOI, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, are categories of medications that inhibit the production of this MAO. So when you're not inhibiting that, it's able to make those neurotransmitters jump that synapse more effectively, right? And so it makes them more effective. Now, it is increasing the activity of serotonin, say. It's also increasing the activity of norepinephrine, and it's increasing the activity of dopamine because it's a broad spectrum. It's all of the monoamine neurotransmitters. And so the range of side effects is the widest in this category of antidepressants. So in the 50s, then, we came along with tricyclic antidepressants. These are the tryptamine, imipramine suffix plants, not plants, medications. Tricyclic antidepressants. So these reduce the reuptake inhibitors. So the same thing, the same process, or a similar process for reducing the neurotransmitters to serotonin and norepinephrine. So we've reduced the number of neurotransmitters affected, and we're reducing another pathway of uptake is not just breaking down that enzyme that's blocking the inhibition, but also there is another pathway of absorption where the body is producing the serotonin, and we have the nervous system has ability to enhance the reuptake of serotonin, reusing it, right? And so we can block the reuptake of serotonin. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These tricyclic antidepressants also work on the reuptake inhibitor pathway and not the enzymatic breakdown pathway, right? The effect is still the same, but it's a different pathway, and it was reducing the number of neurotransmitters affected, so it reduced the number of side effects. But it was still affecting serotonin, right? And so it was still having a positive effect generally on depression and mood. And then in the 80s, we came up with the SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And with these, this is Zoloft and Lexapro and Paxil, Prozac, kind of the primary ones that are being used right now, are selective, right? So the tricyclic was not selective. It was hitting a wider range, but with the SSRs, they're selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They're just hitting serotonin and none of the other neurotransmitters. And so the side effects are minimized. The effectiveness is really, really up. High rent. Thank you very much. Yeah. So the thing that links all of them is that all of them have an effect on serotonin. And so the primary concern with interactions of St. John's wort with medications, this is the primary thing we want to be mindful of, beyond the liver function things that, again, we already talked about, that's in the earlier video. Here we're looking at what's called serotonin syndrome. So in serotonin syndrome, we have a condition where we really deranged the utilization of serotonin in the body. And so we're going to see a lot of excessive serotonin symptoms. And so that's going to be, I have a list of all of the effects. So this is within hours of taking a medication and an herb that there's going to be an interaction, right? This is not a cumulative effect. Generally, we're going to see it pretty rapidly. So we're going to see tremors, a lot of things having to do with spasticity of the nerves and spasticity of the muscles, right? So tremors, spasticity, cramps, hyperreflexia, just kind of general jumpiness, muscle rigidity, especially in the legs. We're going to see a lot of that. We're also going to see heart palpitation, elevated blood pressure, sweating, dilated pupils, agitation, confusion, elevated blood pressure, if I didn't say that. Saying that, yeah.
This is if you take St. John's Wort with the Zoloft or something?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. If your body just has too high an amount, this is going to be happening. And so you just discontinue usage, right? But this is the primary concern that a lot of people have with St. John's Wort. And we have seen this interaction happening. It isn't common, particularly if we're using things like the tea and the tincture form, because we're not using that highly concentrated form of the plant like when we're using the standardized extract. We're going to likely see a lot more of these side effects associated with this specific interaction. When we have the whole plant extracts as tea, as the tinctures, we're likely to see a milder effect. If we do see some of the beginnings of something like a serotonin syndrome kind of effect, we can modify that. We can discontinue it when there still is just a little bit of a, hey, not feeling great about this, without having like a strong therapeutic dosage that we have to dial back and can be challenging to dial back. So for people who are on medications who want to use St. John's Wort with those medications, I would generally not, but a lot of people do like to use St. John's Wort as an adjunct therapy for support if they're trying to get off of medications that work on the serotonin pathways. And the benefit of taking something, again, in a tea or a tincture form is that you can start the dosage very, very, very low. And so you can slowly increase those up. But the other thing that you can be mindful of is that you don't have to take something that works specifically on that pathway. Again, if we narrow our understanding of St. John's Wort to just serotonin, I think we lose a lot of the chemistry, the therapeutic nature, and the magic of working with St. John's Wort, right? It is much more than that, and we can see that by the actual lack of significant effects there. Not to say that they're not there, but when used appropriately, the side effects can be minimized, if not completely negated. So, but in the absence of or in the presence of any concerns, you would certainly just not use St. John's Wort and use some of the many other nervines that are also available. So I have some of those nervines with me today. So again, we're going to look at formulation in a tea form. We can use the tincture. Again, the tincture is really, really wonderful, but I do want to normalize the use of the tea and get people to feel much more comfortable about the use of the tea and not have that mindset that says that, oh no, you can only use the tincture. The tincture is the only form. The tea is great. It's just milder. So St. John's Wort as a tea, we're going to, you can see all of the happy little yellow flowers in there. So St. John's Wort tea, if it is a really good tea, as when we had the St. John's Wort in the first class, you'll actually see the tea turn a little bit red. And that's a really good indicator that there is still some active dianthrones in even the dried plant. Although, again, as a reminder, as we discussed last week, they will not ever come out in the oil if it is dried. Oil is much more picky. But St. John's wort, we're going to use as our base, and we already know about St. John's wort. So we can add to that, I'm just going to put our list. So St. John's wort, we certainly want to think of as one of our primary nervous system tropho-restoratives, right? It feeds and nourishing and building not only in a generalized psychological and emotional way, but also in a structural way. It is repairing and rebuilding damaged nerve tissue. So we think of St. John's wort as a tropho-restorative for the nervous system in general, but also for damaged nerve tissue when there's trauma specifically with the nerve tissue. As we see if there's things like shingles, right, as a virus that lives along those nerve pathways and causes damage along those nerve pathways, or when we think of sciatica, right, where we have damage specifically to that structural damage to the nerve body. If we have like damage to the finger, crushing the finger in a door, where we have physical structural damage to the nerves, right? So we think of the structural damage as well as the nervous system support. Along with that is another tropho-restorative for the nervous system is skullcap. You're going to be like familiar with all of the plants here, so we're not going to talk about them too much because they're the nervines. We just love them. But these are the nervines that I think go well specifically with the St. John's wort. Skullcap is another nervous system tropho-restorative. Skullcap kind of potentiates other plants that it's combined with. So we really love skullcap. It is not a physiological nervous system tropho-restorative. It is much more a psychological nervous system tropho-restorative. It is really nice for those conditions where we tend to have overactive brains and we want to kind of quiet down that chattiness in the brain without being strongly sedating, right? So passion flower also has that quality, but passion flower is a little bit more sedating. And so if you want to be sedating, you can choose the passion flower. If you want something that's going to be more just generally restorative and tonic, you can go with the skullcap. But skullcap is one of those plants that I really love to put into almost any formula that's going to have anything to do with the nervous system. And particularly if you're wanting to make a formula where you're not going to be using St. John's wort, because you do need to have, or optimally in your formulation, you always want to have some herb that is going to be a tropho-restorative for the system that you're working on, in this case, the nervous system. Here we have two, we'll have a couple more, but we could certainly, if you were someone who was being cautious with the use of St. John's wort, that would be fine. You could overlap that and then start to slowly increase the St. John's wort as you were decreasing the intake of your medications that you were taking that may be working on those similar pathways. Let's see, gotu kola. So gotu kola is a cephalic, a plant for the brain, for mental clarity and focus. It is a Medya rasayana, a plant that's good for all different brains and all of the different weird brains that all of us have. It's just going to be nourishing and building and supportive to whatever your weird little brain does. Gotu kola is great for that. So I really love gotu kola. Is another plant that I do generally put into most formulas having to do with the nervous system, just because it is so wonderful. It is so restorative. It is also an adaptogen, so it's helpful for regulating that stress response. Stress response is a really important part of all of this. And side benefit of use of gotu kola is its effects on dermatology, on the skin. So if you are also dealing with a system or a condition where you've got skin stuff going on, or you just want to have some support for the skin, heck yeah, grab gotu kola, because that's a nice little side benefit that you're getting. Kind of like the skullcap and the chatty brain, right? We see in the use of herbs many different side benefits that come along with them. Gotu kola has lots of them. So Tulsi is the other one. Again, these are plants that just tend to always show up in formulas for me because I love them so much. But Tulsi with St. John's wort, this is also a really great pairing, a natural pairing, because of Tulsi's effects as an adaptogen in reducing that stress response, but also increasing clarity and focus, increasing mental alertness while reducing that stress response. And that reduced stress response allows for that nervous system to kind of self-regulate a little bit more easily, right? So it's really nice if we are, combine something that is directly supportive to the nervous system with something that's helping to regulate the autonomic part of the nervous system, because that autonomic nervous system stimulation is the thing that generally causes collapse of the nervous system as a whole. Right, so we always want to think of how are we giving that adaptogenic support when we're looking at that nervous system. Rosemary. So now we're getting out of the kind of wide spectrum into the more specific. So rosemary, one of the primary, again, cephalics for brain function, mental alertness, mental acuity, but definitely warming and stimulating, right? Increases circulation through the body, increases kind of fire. So rosemary is a great addition here where you do want to bring in that heat and warmth and stimulation that is sometimes missing, right? If we're looking at St. John's wort as an antidepressant, we want to also consider that kind of larger category. Actually, I wanted to talk about this when I was talking about the differentiation between the antidepressant medications. We tend to think about St. John's wort as an alternative to these medications. And I inadvertently just reinforce that by talking about those medications and talking about serotonin, but we really don't understand how St. John's wort works. And we know that it works in a lot of different ways that have nothing to do with that serotonin. And so, so we want to kind of think about the energetics of St. John's wort, right? The qualities that St. John's wort has, the solar affinity that it has, right? We've talked about this in the last couple of classes. There's all of these ways that St. John's wort kind of shows up and reacts to the presence of sun, increases the our sensitivity to the sunshine, while also protecting us against too much exposure to the sunshine. And when we think of the sun, and it's the fact that depression is inherently a depressed, right? A depressed vital state. It's a decreased vitality, inherently a cold, damp, kind of withdrawn, dark, right, state. And so when we're using plants that have warmth, like rosemary, or this kind of solar energy like St. John's wort, when we're using specifically those energetic patterns with those plants, it can really help us to, number one, get out of that mindset of depression being just something having to do with serotonin, because it is so much more complex than that. And there are so many different variables and so many different contributing factors that we really do people with depression and the plants and all of the tools that we need for depression a disservice when we narrow the discussion down to just serotonin or anything like that. So yeah, rosemary is warming and stimulating and vital, and depression is an inherently cold, damp, energetic pattern. So if you can work with that pattern, offsetting that pattern, again, like anxiety tends to be more of an irritated, often hot, but sometimes cold, inflamed, reactive state that we want to kind of calm down, right? So we can work with those energetic patterns and not get bogged down in the, well, what category of antidepressants does St. John's wort fall into? It doesn't, because it's not one of those. Yes, it has an effect on serotonin, but it is much more broad than that. That's part of the magic of working with the plants, is we don't know, and that's really cool, and it's also okay. So rosemary, warming, stimulating, contributing to that kind of that sunshine and fire of St. John's wort, if that is what's called for. Lemon balm. A little bit opposite of that, lemon balm, more calming, much better for anxiety, right? So maybe you have St. John, some depression with some anxiety and reactivity. The lemon balm is going to be more helpful for calming and soothing that, whereas the St. John's wort and rosemary would be more warming and stimulating. Both of them would be great. Even combined together, St. John's wort and rosemary and lemon balm could also be beneficial given specific people and constitutional tendencies. So lemon balm, very uplifting to the mood. So it is a plant of joy. So it's helpful for that. Along with that, it's a plant of joy is mimosa. And here I have the mimosa bark, which I grabbed the mimosa bark as I was just leaving the apothecary. And as I was setting up, I regretted it because everything else that I have is leaves and flowers, and the bark was the bark. And I was looking, working with mimosa flowers is frankly kind of a pain in the butt because they all clump together, they stick together, they just don't mix really well. And the bark is really nice, and the bark is actually more traditional than the flowers anyway. Should have grabbed the flowers, didn't grab the flowers. And sometimes you have plants in your apothecary that are like, it's not an optimal form of the plant, but that's what I got. So that's fine. And that's part of the lesson today, is that sometimes you're going to use parts of the plant that aren't optimal, but they're what you have, and that's fine. So we're going to use the mimosa bark. Mimosa bark does have a little bit more of a grounding effect, where the flowers have more of an uplifting effect. And again, sometimes you need either one of those, and they're both appropriate depending on how your mood change is manifesting in your body. Mimosa bark is also very effective for pain, and quite often there can be a chronic pain aspect of depression. If you're constantly dealing with this low-grade pain, oh God, of course that's going to cause you to feel some depression. So when that's a factor, then you do actually want the mimosa bark, because mimosa bark is so effective for that. The bark is relatively finely chopped, and so we'll talk about formulation with that in with these leaves and flowers. But mimosa bark, Heiwan Pi is the bark, Heiwan Hua is the flower, Heiwan Pi translates to the tree of collective happiness. The tree of collective happiness. So this is a plant that is traditionally used for mood elevation, for uplifting the spirit, for what's called disturbed Shen. Disturbed Shen is disturbed heart energy. So sadness, grief, anger, right? Not to pathologize any of those, but sometimes you just don't want to be feeling all the feels. And so it's nice to use a plant that can modify those. And actually, most of these plants kind of fall into that category, right? And it's okay to give that support. So mimosa bark will be helpful there. Now, here, let's talk about formulation with that mimosa bark, because if we are using a mimosa bark, everything else, lemon balm, rosemary, not only do we have leaves and flowers, but we also have a lot of aromatics here, right? Which would also be kind of grumpy if we are extracting them with the bark. But if we do an initial extraction using heat and then let it cool down and do a long-term extraction with thyme, this is one of the ways that we can work with something like this, particularly as the mimosa bark is relatively finely shredded and it's pretty happy to be extracted into water. So we'll go ahead and formulate with this, and then optimally, the way you would steep this is the way that I prefer to steep anyway, which would be bring your water to a boil, add the herbs, cover it up, stir it, cover it up, and then let that sit overnight, or let it sit for 6 to 8 hours. You can do it in the morning and just let it sit all day. Do it at night before you go to bed and just let it sit overnight. And so you get the initial heat softening and breaking down the decoctable ingredients like this mimosa bark, and getting kind of this initial extraction of these aromatics with that initial burst of heat, but then we're not maintaining that heat, and we have a closed sealed container, so we're capturing all of those aromatics. And as the temperature goes down, that's going to be protective for those aromatics, but we will get that long-term extraction going on because it's exposed overnight, and we're going to get those other more kind of stubborn compounds coming out of the mimosa bark. So when you have a formula that's kind of like that initial hit of heat, and then long-term extraction with that heat dropping down, that's a really good way of getting extraction in that area. All right, so I'm going to bring these herbs down here. Y'all know the drill. There's your things there. The names facing towards you are the names of the plants that you're working with. And then you can use your bags. And make your teas. Any questions about any of this from you folks? This is our final class with St. John's Wort. We'll be going to a new plant next
Actually,
next week. Yes.
Using the St. John's Wort in tea form, would that still have a strong effect on the cytochrome P450 pathways and the other pathways?
I would. So the question, if you didn't hear it, is would the St. John's Wort in the tea form still have an effect on the cytochrome P450 enzyme pathways?
Yeah, as strong of an effect.
Yeah, as strong an effect. We don't know. Probably not. Probably a milder effect, but it would still be there. And the problem is, even if it's mild or strong, it's an unknown effect, and you can't plan for an unknown effect, right? So might be high, might be low, might be variable, might not be there, is even more problematic than, yes, it's going to be high and this is how high it's going to be. And so this is a way that you can sort of offset it. Yeah. So on the other hand, again, the benefit of using something like a tea or a tincture is that none of that is absolute, right? And so you can, I mean, it's beneficial. Okay. All right. So number one, the cytochrome P450 enzyme pathway is inherently a beneficial pathway, right? It's good for us. That's how our body detoxifies a whole bunch of stuff. And there's lots of things in our environment that affect that pathway. A lot of the foods that we eat, a lot of the other herbs that we use, rosemary affects the cytochrome P450 enzyme pathway. Garlic does, dandelion root does, red wine does, kava does. There's a lot of plants that either induce or inhibit, increase or decrease that enzymatic pathway, that liver pathway. And some, like garlic, do both. The different chemistry of garlic, there are inductors and there are inhibitors of cytochrome P450. Both in garlic, it's going to change if it's raw or if it's heated. It's very, very, very complex. And so we are still relatively in our infancy in our understanding of this pathway. And so we have a lot of information, but we don't exactly know what to do with all of it, and we're juggling it. In the interest of caution and protection, you would say, yeah, if you have something that's going to affect that pathway, I would be, cautious and mindful of it. But also, if you have a tea that is a little bit of St. John's Wort, if it's all of these all together, right, the fraction of St. John's Wort in that blend is going to be less of an effect on your cytochrome P450 enzyme pathway than the garlic bread that you ate with your dinner the night before, right? Especially if that was with some red wine, right? So there's just so many things that affect it. And we have this idea that St. John's Wort, and then what is the one that drops that? So St. John's Wort is an inducer of this pathway, increases the pathway, which is detoxification. There's another one that we talked about, which is an inhibitor of this pathway. It works opposite to St. John's Wort. Do you remember what that is? This is one of the other really common medication side effects, the other primary medication side effect. Yes, grapefruit. Yes, 10 points to Brittany. Yeah, exactly. So grapefruit does exactly the opposite of this. And so we're always like freaked out about grapefruit and St. John's wort when the reality is there's a lot of things that are going to affect that. And certainly in terms of the total volume of the things that we're eating, because we're unlikely to eat a large amount of St. John's wort, but it's really likely that we're going to drink a large amount of red wine or garlic or rosemary. A lot more of those in terms of volume, just because they're delicious and they're common, than the little bit of St. John's wort in our tea. So we don't know the answer to that. But, you know, understanding the person that you're dealing with, their own sensitivity.
My biggest thing is because I have a few people that I think could use St. John wort,
Uh-huh.
but they take medication
Right.
that I don't want to take that risk.
Yes.
The interactions with.
Yes.
And so I'm kind of skeptical and I kind of back on
Mhm.
it, but I kind of really want to try it.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
I also don't want to mess up anything else that they're dealing with. So
Right, right. And especially as
And that
a
will
licensed
also-
practitioner,
yeah.
you could be sued by them. If something happened, a horrible thing happened, even if it has nothing to do with an actual interaction of the St. John's wort and the medication that they're on, if they think it is, because they're going to start looking for an interaction. If they start taking it, they're going to be like, whoa, I'm taking St. John's wort and this medication. So anything untoward that happens in my body is likely to be that medication, a side effect there.
Yeah.
And who gave it to me? You did, right? And so this is one of the things, the litigious nature of the culture that we find ourselves in, the inability of people to take responsibility for their own body and their own actions and decisions that they make over their own body and their own actions, makes it really, really important to ask those questions and ask whether you are in a position to be giving that information out to someone or not. Yeah, yeah, and it's not an easy question
Yeah.
to answer, because it's not an easy answer.
And that's why I was wondering with the tea, making
Yeah.
like a formula with the tea, keeping that really low,
Mm-hmm.
and then seeing how that.
I would say yes, but if someone had, especially in dominant culture right now, if you gave someone an innocuous amount of St. John's wort in a tea blend, say this tea blend right here, where St. John's wort is 1/8 of the formula, and they have an increase in blood pressure, and someone goes, oh, serotonin syndrome, because you gave St. John's wort, and now they have serotonin syndrome and this elevated blood pressure.
But it could literally be like garlic. It could be something else.
It could be stress because they were at the doctor's office and the doctor took their. It could be that they watched Fox News. It could be so many other things. But that's the thing that they're going to be looking at. And especially if they have a doctor who's like pissed off about herbs, and they're going to be like, serotonin syndrome, you gave them St. John's wort as, 1/10 of the formula in this tea, and they had a 1/4 cup of the tea, and they started having an elevation of blood pressure, and you poisoned them. That is the mindset that some people have. And so it is, yeah. Yeah, I would, and especially if you're working, you said that they're elders largely.
Yeah.
And so the possibility of medications increases.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would
That's why I
use
kinda
other
thought-
nervines. Yeah, use
Yeah,
other
I have them on
nervines.
other nervines, but I kind of stay like.
Yeah.
St.
Yeah.
John wort just in general, but I know that.
It is a wise
It
idea.
would be such a good thing.
I know, that's the thing. It would be really good for so many people to add in there, but the fear around it, because of the effects of serotonin are big. Yeah. So all of that is true. Was it helpful?
No.
Yeah, it didn't. It didn't feel helpful.
put me back
It
in the
was
same
true,
place I
but it didn't feel
am.
helpful.
No, but yeah, I understand.
Yeah. But especially because you have a license.
Yeah.
Yeah. As an unlicensed practitioner, it's like, yeah, sue me. What are you going to get from me? You're going to get a bunch of books and plants. And yeah, it's like
Yeah,
I just don't
somebody
have
who
a
doesn't
lot
take
here.
medication
absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely.
anybody who's on medications and kind of already.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate because that reinforces that idea that, oh, it's so dangerous and it has to be kept away from medications. But also, it might be, and we might have to, but also probably not. Yeah.
And a lot of times you can go in and look at the specific medication and it'll actually tell you if it's a known reaction with it. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
So,
Because
you
they
know-
know
Yeah.
the pharmacokinetics of the medication, how the plant is broken down in the body and how it's cleared. The medication kinetics, the movement of medication through the body. So the pharmacokinetics, how it's moved through and out of the body is absolutely, you can go in and look up on drugs.com, whatever, look up your medication, and it'll show the pharmacokinetics, the pathway of elimination in the body. And if it's cleared via the liver, it will quite often say, no St. John's wort along with this. If it's cleared through the kidneys, then you know there's not an interaction for that medication because it's not cleared through that pathway. There's other pathways of elimination, but that's a great point, is that you can just look up your medication and either it will say no St. John's wort, or it will say cleared via hepatic detoxification pathways. Hepatic means liver, or it'll say liver, or it'll say cytochrome P450, CYP450, or CYP if it has any kind of CYP suffix. That's a cytochrome enzyme system. And so, yeah, that's how you can find out if your medication is cleared in pathways where the St. John's wort is interacting there. And if it's any kind of a serotonin based medication, then there also can be 2 areas of side effects. All right, so we're going to formulate here. What plant I have? Oh, I have it written there. I have it written down, Danielle, but I don't remember what it is. Do you have a plant in mind of what you want to see talked about? I'm certainly open to. I have my calendar, but I'm certainly open to. I just go with plants that I'm interested in, but I'm down for doing ones that you're interested in. So let me know if there's plants you want me to cover, and then I'll post it earlier, because yes, I like it to have you come with your tea and drink tea with me. So passion builders, things that build passion. Am I reading that correctly, Len? Because there's so many ways that we can go with that, right? There's lots of different ways that passion presents in the world and in your body, and lots of different ways to build that. That's fun. Have we done Damiana? I mean, that's the obvious one.
Yeah, we did.
We did Damiana, right? Okay, yeah.
Because we mixed it with mimosas.
That's right. You made that combo. Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
I've built a couple of kind of aphrodisiac type things with it. So.
Yeah.
I don't know what else besides Damiana.
Either, so we could do cacao.
Ooh.
Should we do cacao?
Yeah, I guess it is.
I'll go find that class. That was also your first thought. Yeah, Ren, that was like this year, wasn't it? Was it earlier this year, the Damiana?
Oh yeah, that was.
Yeah. It's here. Yeah, the Damiana.
Chocolate right now. I don't have a good
No.
relationship.
Oh no, why?
Just my acid reflux.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
just need to modify that. That's right.
I need to like go back about a year and then start.
You can do a reset,
Yeah.
reboot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think cacao is a good thing. Or cardamom. Cardamom was actually what I was thinking, because cardamom would also be.
Is that African?
Cacao would be fun just in time for fall. Yeah. Should we do cacao? Okay, we'll do cacao. We'll do cacao. Because I also have some really fun cacao recipes. Really, really fun cacao recipes. I'm also sad that you wrote just in time for fall, because that just made me realize that, oh my God, we're getting ready for fall. I was like, no, but it's just the beginning of summer. We can't be getting ready for fall when it's just the beginning of summer. Yeah. Cardamom too, didn't realize it's passion. Cardamom is, passion. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Cardamom is the sexiest of all of the spices. It is by far the sexiest. And yeah, I know. We can be not happy about it together though. So at least we're together. So go and drown your sorrows in some cardamom, because we'll talk about cardamom. I know I talk about cardamom in the Damiana class because they just go together so well for me. And we'll certainly talk about it in the cacao class because same. So we'll do that. Good night. Good night. Bye-bye. Whatever. See you later. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Well, depending on where they are in the world.
I know there is. That's true.